The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, adapted by James Howe, illustrated by Nancy Sipple Carpenter. Chapter 1. Misselthwaite Manor. When Mary Lennox came to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everyone said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. She arrived from India after an epidemic of deadly cholera had swept through that country like a hot, relentless wind. Many people had died, and among them were Mary's parents. Now, were it not for her Uncle Archibald Craven, Mary would have found herself quite alone in the world. She did not miss her parents, for she had hardly known them. Her father had always been busy. And her mother, who had not wanted a little girl at all, had handed her over to the care of servants from the time Mary was born. As she was a sickly child, all the servants obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything. And now that her parents and all her servants were gone, she fully expected that whoever took care of her next would continue to obey her and give her whatever she demanded. Mary had a thin little face and a thin little body, thin light hair and a very sour expression. She never smiled, not once, during the long voyage to England. This she made under the care of an officer's wife, who was rather glad to hand her over to the woman that Mr. Archibald Craven sent to meet her in London as housekeeper, Mrs. Medlock. "My word! She's a plain little piece of goods," said Mrs. Medlock of Mary, who pretended not to hear. "Perhaps she will improve as she grows older," the officer's wife said good-naturedly. "She'll have to alter a good deal," answered Mrs. Medlock. "And there's nothing likely to improve children at Misselthwaite, if you ask me." Mary did not like the stout woman, whose flushed face she found common, but as she very seldom liked people, there was nothing remarkable in that. Still, she could not help but wonder about her uncle and the place he lived in. She had heard he was a hunchback. What was a hunchback? She wondered. She had never seen one. The next day they set out on their journey to Yorkshire. Mary sat in her corner of the railway carriage and looked plain and fretful. Her black dress made her skin look yellower than ever, and her limp hair straggled from under her black hat. "I suppose you might as well be told something about where you're going to," said Mrs. Medlock gruffly. "It's a queer place." Mary said nothing at all. Mrs. Medlock looked rather put out by her apparent indifference, but went on. "The house is 600 years old and it's on the edge of the moor, and there's near 100 rooms in it, though most of them's shut up and locked. And there's a park round it and gardens and trees." She paused and took a breath. "But there's nothing else," she ended suddenly. Mary sat still. "What you're to be kept at Misselthwaite Manor for I don't know. He's not going to trouble himself about you, that's sure and certain. He never troubles himself about no one." She stopped herself as if she had remembered something just in time. "He's got a crooked back," she said. "That set him wrong. He was a sour young man and got no good of all his money and big place till he was married." Mary's eyes turned toward Mrs. Medlock in spite of her intention to seem not to care. Seeing this, the housekeeper continued. "She was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass she wanted. When she died—" "Oh! Did she die?" Mary exclaimed, quite without meaning to. Suddenly she felt sorry for Mr. Archibald Craven. "Yes," Mrs. Medlock answered. "And it made him queerer than ever. He cares about nobody. He won't see people. And 10 to 1 he won't see you. Most of the time he goes away, and when he's at Misselthwaite, he shuts himself up in the west wing." Mary gazed out the train window at the grey rainstorm, which looked as if it would go on forever. "You mustn't expect that there will be people to talk to you," Mrs. Medlock said. "You'll have to play alone and look after yourself." The grayness grew heavier and heavier before Mary's eyes, and she fell asleep. It was quite dark when she awakened. "You have had a sleep," Mrs. Medlock said. We're at Thwaite Station. A carriage is waiting. We've a long drive before us. Inside the carriage, Mary sat and looked out the window, curious to see something of the road over which she was being driven to the queer place Mrs. Medlock had spoken of. There was no knowing what might happen in a house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up, a house standing on the edge of a moor. On and on they drove through the darkness, and though the rain stopped, the wind rushed by and whistled and made strange sounds. Mary felt that the wide, bleak moor was an expanse of black ocean through which she was passing on a strip of dry land. "I don't like it," she said to herself. "I don't like it," and she pinched her thin lips tightly together. Mary could not see the house clearly when at last they arrived, except that it was immensely long and seemed to ramble around a stone court. One window in an upstairs corner showed a dull glow. "You are to take her to her room," a thin old man instructed Mrs. Medlock. "He doesn't want to see her. He's going to London in the morning." And then little Mary was led up a staircase and down a long corridor and then down another and another, until finally a door was opened, and she found herself in a room with a fire and a supper on the table. "Well, here you are," said Mrs. Medlock. "This room and the next are where you'll live, and you must keep to them. Don't you forget that." It was in this way that Mary Lennox arrived at Misselthwaite Manor, and she had perhaps never felt quite so disagreeable in all her life. Chapter 2, Martha. Next morning Mary was awakened by a young housemaid whose name was Martha. "It's time for thee to get up now," said Martha in a broad Yorkshire accent. "Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry thy breakfast into the room next to this." "Who is going to dress me?" demanded Mary. "Cannot thou dress thyself?" Martha uttered in amazement. "No," answered Mary quite indignantly. "I never did in my life." "Well," said Martha, "it's time thou should learn." It was something of a shock to Mary that the servants in Yorkshire were not in the least like the servants she had known in India. She suddenly felt horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood. "Those are not my clothes," she said moments later, standing before the wardrobe. "Mine are black." "Mr. Craven ordered Mrs. Medlock to get them in London," said Martha, helping Mary to button up. "He said, I won't have a child dressed in black wanderin' about like a lost soul. It'd make the place sadder than it is. Put color on her." Secretly Mary was glad. She didn't like black things. When she went into the next room, a good, hearty breakfast awaited her. "I don't want it," said Mary, who had always had a very small appetite. "Thou doesn't want thy porridge," exclaimed Martha. "If my brothers and sisters was at this table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes." "Why?" said Mary coldly. "Why?" echoed Martha. "Because they scarce ever had their stomachs full in their lives. There's 12 of 'em, and my father only gets 16 shilling a week. They're as hungry as young hawks and foxes." "I don't know what it is to be hungry," said Mary. "Well, it would do thee good to try it," declared the young maid. And after Mary drank some tea and ate a little bit of toast, Martha said, "You wrap up warm, now, and run out and play." "Will you go with me?" asked Mary. Martha stared. "You'll go by yourself," she answered. "You'll have to learn to play like other children does. Our Dickon goes off on the moor by himself and plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony he now calls his own. He's got sheep on the moor that knows him and birds as come and eats out of his hand." "Who is Dickon?" asked Mary. "My brother, miss. He's 12 years old. Dickon's a kind lad, and animals like him." Mary had never possessed a pet of her own and had always thought she should like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon, and as she had never before been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. It was, in fact, this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out. Martha showed her the way to the gardens. But there's one garden is locked up, she said. No one has been in it for 10 years. Why? Mary asked. 10 years was a long time. She had been born 10 years ago. Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden. He won't let no one go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole and buried the key. Mary turned down the walk that led to the gardens. She could not help thinking about the garden that no one had been in for 10 years. Here was another locked door added to the 100 in the strange house. Mary looked about her as she walked. There were trees, and flower beds, and evergreens clipped into strange shapes, and a large pool with an old gray fountain in its midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. At the end of the path that she was following there was a wall with a door in it. The door stood open. Inside was a garden with walls all around it, only one of several walled gardens that seemed to open into one another. Mary came upon a second door and turned its handle. She hoped the door would not open, because she wanted to be sure she had found the mysterious garden, but the door did open quite easily, and she walked through it and found herself in an orchard. Walls ran along it also. One wall, which was covered with dark green ivy, seemed to extend beyond the orchard as if it enclosed. Perhaps it was because she had nothing whatever to do that she thought so much of the deserted garden. She was curious about it and wanted to see what it was like. Why had Mr. Archibald Craven buried the key? If he had liked his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? She thought of the robin and of the way he seemed to sing his song at her, and as she remembered the treetop he perched on, she stopped walking rather suddenly along the path. I believe that tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was, she said. There was a wall round the place, and there was no door. That night, after Mary had finished her supper, she turned to Martha as they sat before the fire. Why does Mr. Craven hate the garden? She said. Art thou thinking about that garden yet? Said Martha. I knew thou would. That was just the way with me when I first heard about it. Why does he hate it? Mary persisted. It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when first they were married, answered Martha. Him and her used to go in and stay there hours and hours, readin' and talkin' and tendin' the flowers. There was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it. And she made roses grow over it, and she used to sit there. But one day when she was sittin' there the branch broke, and she fell on the ground and was hurt so bad that next day she died. The doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and die too. That's why he hates it. No one's never gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind howling outside the house. But as she was listening she began to hear something else. She did not know what it was, because at first she could scarcely distinguish it from the wind itself. Do you hear anyone crying? She said. Martha suddenly looked confused. No, she answered. It's the wind. But listen, said Mary. It's in the house down one of those long corridors. And at that very moment a great rushing draught blew along the passage and the door of the room they sat in was blown open with a crash, and the crying sound could be heard more plainly than ever. There, said Mary. I told you so. It is the wind, said Martha stubbornly, and she ran and shut the door. But something troubled and awkward in her manner made Mary stare very hard at her. She did not believe that Martha was speaking the truth. Chapter 3, The Robin Who Showed the Way. First, each day that passed was exactly like the others for Mary Lennox. Every morning she awoke and found Martha kneeling upon the hearth and building her fire, and after breakfast Mary gazed out the window at the huge moor, which seemed to spread out on all sides and climb up to the sky. She realized that if she did not go out, she would have to stay in the big, gloomy house and do nothing, and so she went out. She did not know that this was the best thing she could have done, for when she walked or ran along the paths, she was stirring her slow blood and making herself stronger. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to her supper at night, she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. Mary's meals were served regularly, and Martha waited on her, but no one bothered about her in the least. Mrs. Medlock came and looked at her every day or two, but no one inquired what she did or told her what to do. Mary supposed that perhaps this was the English way of treating children. She was even learning to dress herself, because Martha looked as though she thought Mary was silly and stupid when she wanted to have things handed to her and put on. Rather than resent Martha's familiar ways, Mary had begun to enjoy hearing about the Moorland cottage, which held 14 people who lived in 4 rooms and never had quite enough to eat. She was most attracted by the stories about Dickon and his animals. "I like Dickon," she said to Martha one morning at breakfast. "But I know he wouldn't like me." "No one does." "How does thou like thyself?" Martha inquired. Mary hesitated a moment. "Not at all, really," she answered. "But I never thought of that before." Martha left to visit her family that day, and Mary felt lonelier than ever. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was to run around and around the fountain flower garden 10 times. When she had finished, she felt in better spirits. "Springtime is coming," she said aloud, sniffing the air in the orchard as she walked toward the path outside the long, ivy-covered wall. Martha had told her that morning that although it was a long way off, springtime was on its way. Suddenly she heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed at her left side, there was the robin she had seen during her first day in the garden. He was hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth. He hopped, flirted his tail, and twittered. It was as if he were talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny breast out and was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was as if he were showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Best of all, he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him. Mary chirped and talked and coaxed, but she did not put out her hand toward him or startle him in the tiniest way. To think that he should actually let her come as near to him as that. She was so happy that she scarcely dared to breathe. The robin hopped about under the shrubs and over to a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up when a dog tried to dig up a mole and, in doing so, scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked up the ring. It was more than a ring, however, it was an old key, which looked as if it had been buried for a long time. Mary Lennox stood up and looked with an almost frightened face at the key that hung from her finger. "Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. "Perhaps it is the key to the garden." She looked at the key for quite a long time before putting it in her pocket and pacing up and down the walk. No one but Mary ever seemed to come here, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall or, rather, at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was a baffling thing. However carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing dark green leaves. It seemed so silly, she said to herself as she looked over the wall at the treetops inside, to be so near the secret garden and not be able to get in. She kept the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she would always carry it with her when she went out so that if she ever should find the hidden door, she would be ready. The next morning, Martha returned from her home across the moor with a gift from her mother for Mary a skipping rope. Mary, who had never seen a skipping rope before, was delighted and, once she understood what it was for, couldn't wait to run outside and try it. She skipped around all the gardens and around the orchard, resting every few minutes. After skipping along her own special walk for a while, she stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, for there, lo and behold, was the robin, swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her, and now he greeted her with a chirp. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know where it is." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy onto the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang a loud, lovely trill. And then something wonderful happened, something that seemed to Mary to be magic. A sudden gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and Mary jumped toward them and caught them in her hand. She had seen something underneath the ivy, a round knob that had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull and push them aside, her heart thumping and her hands shaking a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away as if he were as excited as she was. She put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found that it fitted the keyhole. She turned the key. And then she took a deep breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was. She held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it, shut it behind her, and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. Chapter 4: The Strangest House. It was the sweetest, most mysterious-looking place anyone could imagine. The high walls that shut it in were covered with the leafless stems of climbing roses, and the ground with grass of wintry brown. One of the things that made the place look strangest and loveliest was the roses that had run all over the trees and swung down in long tendrils which made light, swaying curtains. Here and there they had caught at each other and made lovely bridges of themselves. It was this hazy tangle from tree to tree that made it all look so mysterious. Indeed, it was different from any other place that Mary had ever seen in her life. She moved away from the door, stepping as softly as if she were afraid of awakening someone. "Is it all a quite dead garden?" she said softly. "I wish it weren't." There were only gray or brown sprays and branches, and none showed any sign of even a tiny leaf bud anywhere. But she was inside the wonderful garden, and she could come through the door under the ivy anytime. She felt as if she had found a world all her own. The robin flew down from his treetop and hopped about or flew after her from one bush to another, as if he were showing her things. Everything was strange and silent, and she seemed to be hundreds of miles away from anyone, but somehow she did not feel lonely at all. All that troubled her was her wish that she knew whether all the roses were dead, or if perhaps some of them had lived and might put out leaves and buds as the weather got warmer. Mary walked about for a while, stopping when she wanted to look at things. In one flower bed, she thought she saw something sticking out of the black earth, some sharp, little, pale green points. "It isn't a quite dead garden," she whispered. "Even if the roses are dead, there are other things alive." She did not know anything about gardening, but the grass seemed so thick in some of the places where the green points were pushing through that she thought they did not have enough room to grow. So she found a sharp piece of wood and knelt down and dug and rooted out the weeds and grass until she made little clear spots around them. Mary went from place to place, digging and weeding, and enjoyed herself immensely. She worked in her garden until it was time to go in to dinner. In fact, she was rather late in remembering, and when she put on her coat and hat and picked up her skipping rope, she could not believe that she had been working for 2 or 3 hours. She had actually been happy all the time, and dozens of the tiny, pale green points were to be seen in the cleared places, looking twice as cheerful as they had looked before, when the grass and weeds had been smothering them. "I shall come back tomorrow," she said, looking all around at her new kingdom and speaking to the trees and the rosebushes as if they heard her. Then she ran lightly across the grass, pushed open the slow old door, and slipped through it under the ivy. She had such red cheeks and such bright eyes and ate such a hearty dinner that Martha was delighted. After she finished eating, she went to her favorite seat on the hearth rug. Martha sat nearby. I wish I had a little spade," she said. "Whatever does thou want a spade for?" asked Martha, laughing. "Art thou goin' to take to diggin'?" Mary looked at the fire and pondered a little. She must be careful if she meant to keep her secret kingdom. She wasn't doing any harm, but if Mr. Craven found out about the open door, he would be fearfully angry and get a new key and lock it up forever. "This is such a big, lovely place," she said slowly. "I thought that if I had a little spade and some seeds, I could dig somewhere and make a little garden." Martha smiled. "I've just thought of something," she said. "What?" asked Mary eagerly. "In the shop at Thwaite they sell packages of flower seeds for a penny each, and our Dickon knows which is the prettiest ones and how to make 'em grow. We could write a letter to him and ask him to go and buy the garden tools and the seeds at the same time." Mary thought it was a wonderful idea, and Martha ran out of the room to fetch a pen and ink and some paper. "If I have a spade," Mary whispered to herself, "I can make the earth nice and soft and dig up weeds. If I have seeds and can make flowers grow, the garden won't be dead at all, it will come alive." Mary waited for what seemed a long time before Martha returned. Then they wrote the letter. This is what Martha dictated to Mary. "My dear Dickon, Miss Mary has plenty of money, and will you go to Thwaite and buy her some flower seeds and a set of garden tools to make a flower bed? Pick the prettiest ones and easy to grow. Give my love to Mother and every one of you. Your loving sister, Martha Sower by." "How shall I get the things when Dickon buys them?" Mary asked. "He'll bring 'em to you himself. He'll like to walk over this way." "Oh," exclaimed Mary, "then I shall see him. I never thought I should see Dickon." And then Mary remembered something. "Martha," she said, "when I waited so long for you to come back, I opened the door and walked down the corridor to see if you were coming. And I heard that far-off crying again, just as we heard it the other night. It couldn't have been the wind, because there is no wind today." "Thou mustn't go walkin' about in corridors and listenin'," said Martha restlessly. "I wasn't listening," said Mary. "I was just waiting for you and I heard it." "That's twice." "My word!" "There's Mrs. Medlock's bell," said Martha, and she ran out of the room. "It's the strangest house anyone ever lived in," said Mary drowsily as she dropped her head on the cushioned seat of the armchair near her. Fresh air, digging, and skipping rope had made her feel so comfortably tired that she soon fell asleep. Chapter 5, Dickon. The sun shone down steadily in the week that followed. Mary learned that Mr. Craven should not be returning to Misselthwaite Manor for some time, as he had gone on from London to travel in foreign lands. There would be no chance now of his discovering that she spent all her days in the secret garden, no chance of his becoming angry with her and locking up the garden forever. He would not be back until the autumn, Martha told her, and so, without telling a soul, Mary claimed the garden as her own, with no fear that Mr. Craven would take it away from her. She worked and dug and pulled up weeds, becoming more pleased with her work with every passing day. It had been almost a month since Mary had come to Misselthwaite Manor, and she was becoming fatter and healthier and happier than she had ever been. She loved to be out of doors, where she felt as alive as the pale green points that sprouted all over the secret garden in the nice, clear places that Mary had made for them. There was a laurel-hedged walk which curved around the secret garden and ended at a gate that opened into a wood. One day she thought she would skip around this walk and look into the wood and see if there were any rabbits hopping about. When she reached the little gate, she opened it and went through because she heard a low, peculiar whistling sound and wanted to find out what it was. It was a very strange thing indeed. She quite caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under a tree, with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy, about 12. On the trunk of the tree he leaned against, a brown squirrel was clinging and watching him, and quite near him were 2 rabbits, sitting up and sniffing with tremulous noses, and, actually, it appeared as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange call of his pipe. When he saw Mary, he held up his hand and spoke to her in a low voice. "Don't thou move," he said. "It 'ud flight 'em." He stopped playing his pipe and rose slowly from the ground. The squirrel scampered back up into the branches of the tree, and the rabbits dropped on all fours and hopped away, though not at all as if they were frightened. "I'm Dickon," the boy said. "I know thou art Miss Mary. I've got the garden tools and the seeds." He spoke to her as if he knew her quite well. But because she felt rather shy, Mary spoke to him a little stiffly. "Will you show the seeds to me?" she asked. They sat on a log, and Dickon began to explain the various kinds of seeds to her. She wished she could talk as he did. His speech was so quick and easy. Suddenly he stopped and turned his head. "Where's that robin as is callin' us?" he said. The chirp came from a thick holly bush, bright with scarlet berries, and Mary thought she knew whose call it was. "Is he really calling us?" she asked. "Aye," said Dickon. "He's callin' someone he's friends with." "I think he knows me a little," Mary said. "Aye, he knows thee," said Dickon quietly. "And he likes thee." "Do you think he really likes me?" cried Mary eagerly. "He wouldn't come near thee if he didn't," answered Dickon. "Do you understand everything birds say?" Dickon's grin spread until he seemed all wide, red, curving mouth, and he rubbed his rough head. "I think I do, and they think I do," he said. "I've lived on the moor with 'em so long. Sometimes I think perhaps I'm a bird, or a fox, or a rabbit, or a squirrel, or even a beetle, and I don't know it." He laughed and began to talk about the flower seeds again. He told Mary what they looked like when they were flowers. He told her how to plant them, and watch them, and feed and water them. "See here, look at her," he said, turning around to "Where is thy garden? Till plant them for thee myself." Mary's thin hands clutched each other as they lay on her lap. "I don't know anything about boys," she said slowly. "Could you keep a secret if I told you one?" "It's a great secret." "I'm keepin' secrets all the time," Dickon answered. Mary did not mean to put out her hand and clutch his sleeve, but she did it. "I've stolen a garden," she said very fast. "Nobody wants it, nobody cares for it, nobody ever goes into it. Perhaps everything in it is dead already, I don't know. Nobody has any right to take it from me when I care about it, and they don't. They're letting it die, all shut in by itself," she ended passionately, and she burst out crying. Dickon's blue eyes grew rounder and rounder. "Where is it?" he asked in a voice both curious and full of sympathy. Mary got up from the log at once. "Come with me and I'll show you," she said. She led him around the laurel path and to the walk where the ivy grew so thickly. "It's this," Mary said as she stepped to the wall and lifted the hanging ivy. "It's a secret garden, and I'm the only one in the world who wants it to be alive." They passed in together. Dickon looked around and around about it, and around again. He almost whispered. "It is a queer, pretty place. It's like as if a body was in a dream. I never thought I'd see it." "Did you know about it?" asked Mary. "Martha told me there was one garden as no one ever went inside," he answered. "Us used to wonder what it was like." "Will there be roses?" Mary whispered. "Can you tell? I thought perhaps they were all dead." "No. Not them, not all of 'em," he said. "They're as wick as you or me." Mary remembered that Martha had told her that wick meant alive. "I'm glad they're wick," she whispered fiercely. "I want them all to be wick. Let us go round the garden and count how many wick ones there are." They went from bush to bush and from tree to tree. Dickon cut the dry and dead wood away and showed Mary how to tell when an unpromising bough or twig still had green life in it. In no time at all they were using the new tools to dig and weed and cut away the dead wood to make room for the living. "There'll be a fountain of roses here this summer," Dickon proclaimed quite suddenly. And then he cried, "Why? Who did that there?" He was pointing to one of Mary's own little clearings around the pale green points. "I did it," said Mary. Dickon went and knelt down by them, smiling his wide smile. "Thou did right," he said. "A gardener couldn't have told me better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. They're crocuses and snowdrops, and these here is daffodillies. They will be a sight." They worked and talked the entire afternoon, and soon they heard the big clock in the courtyard strike the hour, and it was time for Mary to go in. "There's a lot more work to do here," Dickon said, admiring all that they had done. "Will you come again and help me do it?" Mary asked. "I'll come every day if thou wants me," he answered stoutly. "It's the best fun I ever had in my life."